I mean, I think we should all answer this question perhaps, but I want to start by asking Darren, because it would be weird to ask. As strange as this may sound, and I mean this about your BBC Scotland series, but also about your book and your work in general, why do you do it?
Good question. Why do I do it? I mean, from a very, very young age, I have always had a compulsion to talk about what's been going on around me. And I think that in my younger days, maybe that was partly a way to process things that were happening in my community, sometimes even in my household. And through the process of doing that, I got validation and recognition from peers and teachers, and so just began that journey that you hear a lot of people talking about, where they display some sort of natural ability to do something, other people compliment them on it, and this becomes a thing that they're passionate about. And really that's really that's the bread and butter of my life since day one, whether I'm doing music, whether I'm doing TV, journalism, the books, whatever, you know. And also I think from a very young age, for whatever reason, and I get asked this a lot at middle class book festivals, you know, people just completely shocked that a working class person can string a sentence together without defecating themselves. And I'm always asked, you know, why, where did you learn to be so articulate? You know, and on one hand, I understand the compliment, and on the other hand, that's a really clumsy thing to ask, you know, like you don't ask someone how did they learn to use a knife and fork, you know. But from a very young age, words, how they were used, what they meant, how they sound, was very important to me. It's like music to me, you know. I don't care what someone is saying at first, if they've constructed it well and they just speak naturally. That's the thing that I find arresting in the first instance, and then I decide what are they talking about and whether I agree with it or not later. And so just words, really, I've just always had a passion about words.
My lived experience is quite slightly different in that, you know, I don't put it in, I'm not coming from a sort of very rooted either working class or middle class position. In fact, I was sort of lost in between those two. My family sort of was transitioned into that sort of middle classes as I was growing up. And so I've always felt, rather than what I do being rooted in lived experience, it's kind of rooted in this sense that I was not really part of any of it. And so it's this insider outsider thing that I guess we should talk about a bit more. But I always looked at TV news, like I said, and felt it didn't really represent ordinary people, let alone did it not represent me. It kind of felt very professionalized. And so that's the why for me. I always wanted to sort of get to ordinary people a bit more, get their voices in and make stuff feel a bit more, you know, sort of representative in that sense, but kind of from an outsider's perspective rather than from, you know, really rooting it in sort of lived experience.
A lot of my background initially, in a professional sense, was arts facilitation. So going into communities or prisons or different social settings and using an activity to try and generate a rapport with the people that you're working with. And ultimately, I always just seen the activity as a means to an end. So it was a conduit for me to become an insider and to display the commonality that I had with the people that I was working with, whether they were working in a community centre or on a street corner. And ultimately, really my instinct always is to try and create the conditions for a very natural relationship to emerge, even just in the course of half an hour, trying to make people feel comfortable and also trying to comfort myself. You guys know what it's like. You just arrive, you parachute into a town, you've got to go around and talk to people. I mean, I think you even said it yourselves in one of the films. You've got to get over your nerves. You're very self-conscious at first. You feel out of your depth. That's the same with everything. But for me, the kind of why I'm doing something is almost something that I retrofit onto it later. I follow my instinct into a situation. I observe the situation. Then I become more intuitive about what it's about, and then I sort of decide what it is that I'm doing. And that's just how I've always worked.
By the time I started full-time reporting it was then. I used to write features all the time. I was sort of new to it all, and there were quite sobering moments when you'd realise that you were flying by the seat of your pants, but it wasn't a bad thing. I remember interviewing a quite a senior politician who said, right, before you turn the tape recorder on, we're both going to sit down, and that's right, isn't it? And let's talk about what we want this interview to say. And I said, what are you talking about? I just put the tape recorder on and ask you questions, and that's it, right? Now, I didn't say, and I'm going to try and ask you questions that really throw you a bit and all that. So, and in my innocence, I just thought it was like interviewing musicians, right? Which, unbeknown to me, meant that the interviews I did were a bit different, right? Because I wasn't sitting down and saying, what message would you like to impart to the public before I switched the tape recorder on, right? And equally, no one had ever told me the rules of walking up and down a high street with a notepad and talking to people. I'd done it a bit at gigs. The NME occasionally used to like send you to a Morrissey concert and find out whether his fans shared his slightly questionable views about X, Y, and Z, right? And you'd have to talk to him. Nobody ever told me how to do it. I mean, I've been to university, but I didn't study journalism. You sort of go into this and you just think, well, I know what I've got to do. I've got to get a story and find out where this place is at. But I'm only going to find out how to do it by doing it.
Well, doing it, so sort of finding out through doing has kind of been probably the signature thing of our series. We didn't know it's not like we came up with the form that it currently is 10 years ago. We just started sort of trying to cover politics. And then we learned through each film that actually we should be doing it this way or that way. And we pretty soon alighted on the fact that talking to ordinary people is kind of, it was the thing that we wanted to do rather than talking to politicians. But the other thing is that applies within each film as well, right? So we're quite conscious of the fact that we don't set out with a script about what the story is going to be. Each film is kind of a journey of discovery. And in fact, the journey is the story that we end up telling. And we usually put that production process into the films as well to try and lay it out and have a kind of honesty and dialogue with the audience there. And so that's very important to us. Darren, honesty is a big part of what you do as well, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think similar to you, the kind of the form that something takes comes after the function. It's like you're shaping the thing around what you're seeing rather than trying to shoehorn reality into your own story or narrative. And sometimes that can be quite frustrating. I mean, I personally, I can totally identify, by the way, with your early experiences of getting into journalism or changing what type of journalism you're involved in. I think like early, before you actually get some experience in the industry or in your community, you can get caught up, and I remember it, getting caught up in all of the kind of minutiae of what about the email? How do I send the email? And how will I pitch an article? And like these were things that really dominated the kind of horizon line of what I thought was going to be difficult about it. So what I didn't realise was, as I was worrying about all that, I didn't realise I had this voice, I had these beliefs, I had this desire. These were things that weren't really discussed much in the class. It was very practical. And so often it can become easy to forget that you have an instinct that's brought you to entering the profession, and that you should try and follow that instinct no matter what. And that's just an aside for anybody who's thinking about that.
The other interesting thing that I was struck by watching some of your BBC Scotland series is the so-called accepted way of doing this, which is really going out into the world and talking to people. I mean, which you would think is the essence of journalism. It's not very complicated, right? But the conventions that have been arrived at in terms of how it's done, and I'm talking about TV, I think to a large degree here, but it also applies to the print media. If you, in the cold light of day, they're insane, right? So I dare say one of the reasons, there's an amazing scene in the Glasgow film where you're walking down the street and you meet a group of 4 guys, I think, and they've all got drug habits. One of them at least has experience of selling heroin, and they're looking for a fix. I think at least a couple of them are. And they talk very candidly about the experience of being an addict and what it feels like and all that, right? Now, I dare say one of the reasons that you're able to have that conversation is because you haven't got a suit on.
Yeah.
Right? And you probably didn't have a camera the size of a house. No. And there wasn't a Nick Broomfield type sound man with a ridiculous looking microphone on the end of a broom handle, right? With several lengths of wire trailing behind him. Now, I've made films for TV, and that's what comes with it, right? So, and straight away then, you're hobbled from the get-go. How are you going to find anything out carrying on like that? I mean, even now, why do TV reporters when they go out into the field, in quote marks, put a suit on. I mean, that's a very strange thing to do in a world in which most people just wear a suit for weddings and funerals. Why are you doing that? You know?
Yeah, I mean, there's the when you read into social mobility data, particularly stuff that's a bit more sophisticated in depth, that's published recently, this phrase "studied informality" comes up. And studied informality is like, in the context of that, it's how you enter middle class spheres. So the studied informality, you're learning all of the little things that you talk about, the references, how you dress, all the things that are socially signaling that you belong to a certain social group or a certain profession. And the people who don't learn those cues often are punished in some minor ways and excluded in different ways. And that's why it's difficult to cross the class ravine. But studied informality is a part of every social group. It's just that the informalities differ. And so what I've found is that I have insight into the informalities of going into a working class community, sometimes even a prison community, as well as, you know, swanning around BBC or swanning around London as you do. And ultimately, I think where a lot of journalists, even ones that come from working class backgrounds, because you need to remember the process of becoming professionalised is partly about renouncing or learning to conceal any trace that you used to come from an estate, you know, because that's how you ascend. But actually, if more people were to draw on their experiences of operating in those communities and don't be so frightened of showing your humanity, and even making the conscious decision not to dress in a suit. I mean, do you think I didn't want to dress in a suit? I was in pretty good shape then. Like, it would have been nice for me to go, do you know what, I'm going to renounce all of this imagery of the housing estate and all this hip-hop imagery, and I'm going to really, like, grab people's attention by turning up in a nice three-piece like a proper journalist. But actually, I felt more comfortable dressing the way that I dressed. And again, it was part of the studied informality. If I'm standing there with a baseball cap and I know the lingo, then it just makes that initial potentially awkward period of engagement much, much easier for me and for the contributors. I mean, is there anything, I just wanted to ask you this. Obviously, you've been doing this thing for 10 years or so, and so obviously that's been a massive learning journey. And I know that you had even acknowledged, you know, with, you know, contrasting your approach to two films that you did about Middlesbrough and just things that you learn. Because I've certainly, like, I mean, I just sometimes feel like it's boot camp constantly with the things that I'm learning and the things I look back on and think I would do that so different.
Totally.
Yeah, I mean, we've you know, from very early on, we wanted to sort of look, you know, and expose, so to say, the sort of social problems and, you know, the gap between sort of the promises in Westminster and the high talk in Westminster and the lived experience of people around the country. But I think too often we went to places and showed the problems, and it's easy to find people complaining about problems or all the things they haven't got and how they've been ignored, you know. And that took us so far, but around about 2015, 2016, we sort of increasingly felt that wasn't enough. It wasn't good enough. And you had to go beyond. You couldn't just come to a place and show all the problems that were very real. And incidentally, the rise of sort of social media helped in it. People would, you know, we did a film in Stoke that we thought was quite a good film, and it was honest and it was true, and it was our experience that we had there, having spent 3 days there. But a small number of people from Stoke came in the comments and said, why do the media only come here and talk about Nigel Farage and UKIP? And you know, talk about sort of Stoke as a left behind kind of place, these kind of cliches that were going around a bit at the time. And that was a kind of turning point for us. And we realized that you know, we had to go beyond that, and we had to really go in search of the redemption, if you like. I think redemption is a word you've used before about your work as well. And there's redemption. Everyone's looking for redemption. Every place has people and organizations who are doing great work and trying to turn
you make it, there's another, this gets back into the why, really, because what I wanted to ask Darren earlier was about a sort of political, at least with a small p, why, which is that to a lesser or greater extent, with all of these films, we're sort of consciously kicking against one or two or three sort of kinds of consensus, right? Like received opinions. And so these films, actually, the films we make, started before austerity had commenced, you know, when it was like the fag end of New Labour, the Gordon Brown period, right? And that was when people's lives and how they fed into politics was still talked about in these awful cliches about aspiration and all that. And the idea that people lived in communities where aspiration was quite a difficult concept, and you had to get to questions of sort of basic subsistence perhaps before you got there. That wasn't in the political conversation at all. Politics has changed in that sense. So that's one thing we were kicking against. Then the coalition came along and we felt we had stories to tell about the reality of what they were doing to society. That was another thing we were kicking against. But the most interesting thing that we kick against, I think, or try to, is sort of our own side. You know, The Guardian is identified with the left liberal side, right? And one of the problems with the left liberal view of the world at large, sometimes at least, is it's like the kindness that kills, and they think that questions of deprivation and disadvantage and inequality are reducible to the idea that places are hopeless, right? Left-wing people, and I include myself in this because I think we were guilty of it, certainly in the first stages of what we were doing. They tend to pitch up in a place and go, isn't it awful here? Life is hopeless. You know, it's been laid waste. It's besieged by poverty and all of this. And all those things might be rooted in the truth, but the kind of statist kind of leftism denies people agency, it says, and it's up to well-meaning people like us to come along and fix your problems. And if you start to reflect that point of view in what you're doing as a journalist, you're in the wrong place. So building in those questions of community initiative and self-help and all that stuff meant we could enter into that conversation and say, actually, the answers are in the places themselves, right? It's not in some distant person writing a column in a newspaper or pulling a lever in Whitehall.
It's worth saying, sorry, just that has reached its absolute peak under sort of coronavirus and lockdown, where we've seen across all kinds of communities, right? Because the state has kind of disappeared from people's lives in many ways, communities have stepped up and really shown that social capital.
There's an interesting point here about how aware of all of these terrible cliches about, you know, benefit street type programs and the sort of portrayal of inequality in the worst possible way, and for that matter, the portrayal of politics as people talk about it in their everyday lives. People know about how those things appear in TV and the print media now. They're very, very aware of it. And it's interesting, the awareness of that, I don't think, was as ingrained when we started making these films.
Yeah.
You know, you could sort of bum up someone and start a conversation, and you'd have a camera and you'd say it's for The Guardian or whatever, and they'd be all right with it, and they'd be quite taken with the novelty of it. It's a very different experience now. I mean, to the point that we were in Milton Keynes, right, about less than a year ago, in a retail park on a Sunday, and a family walked past, and a 10-year-old who was about 9 or 10 with the family said, "Oh, are you doing one of them Brexit things?" Like he did straight away, right? And let alone if you're dealing with someone, an adult you want to speak to, they know, right? Oh, I know the game here. I know the game. You're going to try and make me say something that a politically correct person would think was dodgy, and then I'll be all over social media and all that. They totally know, which A, you have to be much more on your game, but B, it's a bit more difficult. I mean, there's one of the films we made in Bury, where we're doing our usual thing of vox popping, and I should make clear, you know, we try and do vox popping in a different way. We don't bowl up people and go, "What do you think of Jeremy Corbyn?" You know, it's a bit more sophisticated. But we gave up that afternoon. There's a film about us giving up
with a big row.
Because everybody just said, "I don't want to talk to you. You're just going to say to me, oh, what do you think about Brexit? I'm going to mention immigration." And then we'll go our separate ways, knowing that this doesn't add to the stock of knowledge or help anything in any way.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, some people would criticise that and say you shouldn't become part of the story, but I think there are different layers of truth that are available here for us to draw from, and in the final analysis, the utter demoralisation of many journalists throughout the process of the last 10 years is definitely part of the story. You know, like even just today, I seen this survey that's done that's showing that public trust in media has plummeted, you know, and it's actually worse on the left than it is on the right. And it was only 10 weeks ago or something, you had, you know, the editor of BuzzFeed on, they're all on bragging, talking about more people than ever are buying newspapers, ha ha ha. I was like, well, they're also rioting over toilet roll, you know, like, let's not get ahead of ourselves here. And so there is with the convergence of social media how that's kind of curdled public discourse, whether you're talking about politics, whether you're talking about identity, or whether you're talking about who should play Batman in the next movie. All debates kind of follow the same kind of trajectory where they just break down after a certain amount of interactions. And so, to see journalists reflecting in any capacity, for the public to understand and that to be humanised, I think is really important. I think that you were obviously following your instincts that day and thinking, actually, maybe this has become what it's about.
I actually say to the camera, I turned to the camera, and it's like most of what we do. It wasn't like most of what you do, right? It wasn't scripted. I just turned around to John and say, this is finished. The very idea of being on the high street in Bury on a drizzly Wednesday afternoon and asking, it was when the whole Brexit thing had stalled for the nth time, and saying to people, what do you think about Brexit, right? It's finished. It's done, right?
Going back to the very first question of the why that's driven sort of me in doing this and the series is just a sort of coming at this from a different kind of point of view, a bit more of humility, a bit more sort of openness, a bit more honesty as well. I think these are the basic building blocks, as well as obviously like getting more diversity into the media, more kind of voices. These are the basic building blocks of rebuilding trust with the media. And I think it's quite an urgent task, to be honest, given where we are as a country.
Yeah.
Not enough journalism acknowledges where it's coming from and the biases that are inbuilt in the very process of who we are and what we're doing. Now, at the same time, you can seek to question that and cut against your own sort of biases and seek to find sort of truths such as they are in your reporting. But one of the pernicious things I've always found about TV news is that it hides behind a veneer of objectivity, right? Because it looks so polished and it's so packaged, and each piece it looks the same, and it's kind of in its manufactured sense. And it has these sort of cut glass voices over it. It gives you this veneer that it's objective, and that's all the more damaging when it's then revealed that underneath it all they got something wrong or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think a bit of openness and honesty about that is important, and that's the way out of that conundrum.
The word objective is very, very difficult, because if you even stand there and say, look, what I'm doing is wholly objective, then you'll get shot down in flames, quite rightly, probably. But I would say that what we do, they're not kind of consciously polemical. And more often than not, and this echoes what John said a while ago, what we're actually trying to do is sort of stress test assumptions of every kind, right? And say, so, that might be everyone who votes for Brexit is a racist, or there's no such thing as structural racism, or you can crudely define working class people into those who want to get the new Labour thing, who want to get on, and those who are welfare dependent, right? All of those, I mean, God knows there are so many assumptions that rattle around politics in any given moment, right? And there's loads of assumptions within journalism and commentary. So in stress testing those things, because that's the fundamental motivation, I'm sure it is for you, is to go out into the world and say, well, what's really happening here, right? Then I think you do arrive at some notion of sort of an authentic, or you try and aim at a sort of authentic portrayal of what's going on. Whether it's objective, I don't know, but it should feel more satisfying than a load of received opinions, right?
Yeah.
And the problem is that so much supposedly objective journalism in the field of news reporting, the received assumptions are absolutely see-through. Even the very fact you choose someone standing outside Downing Street with a little sign at 10 at night when there's no one in there, with a sign saying live, and they go, well, I'm hearing from insiders that Rishi Sunak has said this to Matt Hancock. The very fact that you've chosen that is indicative of received opinion. It's the received opinion of that counts for anything at all. Because what actually counts for something is that 60,000 people are dead, right? If you want to take the negative view of it, or more positively, that communities are organising as never before. But I don't see much of that, certainly the second one, compared to people standing there telling me that I have to really have an active and consuming interest in what a Downing Street source has said about Matt Hancock. When the truth is, you and I know that doesn't count for anything, really.
For years, I've seen how sort of poverty, if you like, and inequality is covered in much of the written press. You see reports about how many million families have used food banks that year, or 60,000 kids have gone without meals and stuff like that, and it leaves people cold. If I'm honest, I mean, you understand it in a theoretical sense, the sort of scandal of it, but what we're in the business of doing and what humans do is tell stories. So the structures underneath it are sort of illuminated by the stories. The systemic problems are sort of revealed by going into sort of individual stories, you know, because otherwise there's no, you're not connecting with people. It's what humans have done since the dawn of time is tell each other stories about things.
Yeah.
And that's really, really important if we're talking about sort of revealing and driving any kind of positive social change, I think.
What I would say for anyone watching, and this is a question, like I said, I get asked a lot, how do we connect with the subject, the person we work with, the person we're reporting on, whatever context it is? And really, I always just say you've got to just walk alongside them for a while. You've got to walk alongside them and just be there long enough. And I think you guys show that more and more with the Anywhere But Westminster series. And really, you've carved out a good lane for yourself where actually you don't need to find time to do that within your other work. Part of your work is to do that. I think that's where other journalists struggle. Maybe they sense sometimes, I could probably be doing with being in this community for a couple of days before I write about it, before I say anything about it. And because of the limited resources within most lines of work now, people really see it as their work, you know, they're being sent there for their work, and when their work is finished, they should just go home. But I think if you want to get into this game, this industry, whatever you call it, you have to be prepared to go in on your own time. If they're not going to give you the hours to go in, you have to go the extra mile. We need to sort of look to Orwell, I think, for a way to be, in terms of like a lot of stuff that he did off his own back. You know, he took jobs just so that he could be in the front line and see things in high resolution. And I think like there's that creativity and that artistry. I think that's where the artistry comes from.
I mean, in actual fact, John and I are quite fortunate because without even trying, really, we managed to convince the people who sign the checks for us that it's all right to go to a place sort of hang about. Do you know what I mean? I mean, you know, I'm not complaining. We don't stay in the Four Seasons Hotel, you know, and dine every night in Michelin-starred restaurants, right? But they're all right with doing it. And I actually think, to sound positive, I think because of these great shocks to the system, so to speak, like Brexit and how popular Scottish independence turned out to be, and the sense that the media had got, by and large, had got those things wrong, I think there is some awareness now that journalism has to change, and therefore you have to allow people to have those immersive experiences that you just talked about, Darren. I think there's more openness to that, and I think people. I mean, a really good example of this. And this is probably the last thing I say. I was in Blackpool with John at the time of the 2010 election. This is a long time ago, and I don't know why. I think he was back in the hotel, the Golden Sands bed and breakfast, editing the film.
How we do it.
And I, for want of anything to do, went to Blackpool Pier, one of the piers. There's three, and I went on the pier, and I didn't know this was going to happen. I don't think. And Peter Mandelson turned up on a bus with the lobby, the Westminster lobby. Now you don't see the lobby very often, right? And all these fellas got off, and they were fellas. They got off the coach, and they all had suits on and black Macs, right? And the pier was full of people, and they were all pointing at Peter Mandelson and saying things about him, and by extension, the Labour Party in the election, right? And not one of these people spoke to anybody on the pier, right? And I was thinking, this is really weird. And I was talking to, by and large, they were pensioners who were eating ice cream about how they felt about the election, and pointing at Peter Mandelson saying, what do you think about him, right? And straight away, I understood why that kind of journalism, the Black Mac sort of journalism, doesn't get you very far. And I think at the time that was probably a sort of somewhat marginal, heretical opinion. And I don't think it is so much now. And that's why I feel a bit better. You know, I mean, even, you know, the fact that we're shortlisted and you won and Darren and all the rest of it, you know, I think parts of the media at least are aligning themselves in roughly the right direction now.
That one was called the road. That was called the Road to Blackpool Pier, right?
Yeah, you've got to keep very good. You have to just keep pushing and making the case.
I got one last question, and it's for Darren, kind of thing, which is at the end of one of your films, I think it was the Dundee film, you said something quite powerful, which was that you sort of turned it on the audience, and you said tackling these social issues, you know, the deprivation, the poverty, it's not enough. You sort of said, you know, everyone here who has been complicit in allowing this to continue has to sort of ask questions of themselves and drive change. And it made me think of more recent messages we've heard from like Black Lives Matter, that it's not enough to be silent on racism. We now have to be actively against it. And I wonder if you feel the same about kind of deprivation, inequality.
Yes,
and
I do.
How we should all think, and what's our takeaway on that then?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even just a couple of weeks ago, in relation to the Black Lives Matter thing, I had a couple of difficult days trying to basically negotiate with my editor and my features editor and two women of colour who I wanted to invite to write my column as guest writers that week. So on one hand, it's very easy to go on social media and talk about platitudes about any issue, Black Lives Matter, feminism, social justice, poverty, but actually it's those little difficult discussions and negotiations that we've got to have behind the scenes wherever we work, whether we're cops or social workers or journalists, and those things are really difficult. So, you know, I could be having a conversation where I'm like, okay, I've got these women, I've asked them to write the column, and then the editor's like, what, 2 people? Like, that's not going to translate well on the comment page. And so then you're dealing with a formatting concern at editorial level of a paper, while you're dealing with 2 women of colour who are concerned that they're going to be portrayed negatively, that they're going to use imagery of dead black people in the paper. And at all times you're interpreting these concerns and you're feeding that back up the food chain, and then you're basically engaged in a negotiation. And I remember by the second day I was like, maybe I'd have been better off not doing this, because underneath it all was this anxiety, it's not going to come out right, somebody's going to be unhappy with how it comes out. And that's why it's difficult. That's why it's difficult. It's almost easier to go on camera and say, and here's what we should be doing, and da-da-da-da-da, and really just be an activist wearing the veil of a journalist, which is pretty much what I'm doing. But actually, it's a call to action on a much more fundamental level than that. This is about, if we need to create resistance within our professions, along lines of politics or along lines of belief, then we absolutely have to do that at certain points. It's about picking your battles, really. If you really want change, if you really want equality, if you really, really care about that stuff, then it means sacrifice, it means difficult conversations, it means being pulled up by other people for your privilege, and sometimes standing your ground and saying, no, you're talking shit, or just conceding that they might be right. But you've got to figure all that out. And I think it's difficult to get that deep on a TV half-an-hour programme. So you've got to condense it all into kind of Blairist sound bites. But at the same time, like it's a way to signal to the audience, look, TV can be different. TV can be a little bit different than it's been. And that's what I was interested in doing.
It seems to me we're at a moment where change is necessary, and it can, like, everyone sitting in professions, be it journalism, filmmaking, TV, you know, law, whatever, it's incumbent upon yourself to ask yourself the questions now, what can we do to change for the better, to both to tackle, like, obviously institutional racism, but also sort of the poverty industry, as you've called it before, Darren, and the perpetuating of all of these structures.
But there's one point runs through all of this, and it doesn't sort of cover the whole of anything, be it Black Lives Matter or why austerity was a terrible idea or any of the things that we cover, which is that, what do we know about power and voice? Well, they're held by interests that are far too narrow, and they need dispersing much more than they have been over the last 30 or 40 years, much more than they have been ever, arguably, right? And then I guess the question you ask yourself as a journalist is, are you helping or hindering that process? Are you dispersing power and voice, or are you keeping it in the restricted and exclusive place that it shouldn't be? Yeah. And I hope in our small way, right, without wanting to sound too pompous about it, we're trying to help. That's kind of it.